Thank you very much, Vladimir, and thank you, Kirill, and others for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm not sure I'll completely answer Vladimir's questions, but I do think there are reasons, not perhaps to be optimistic so much as to question the extreme pessimism into which some people, I think, have fallen, in particular with regard to the state of democracy around the world. But that isn't primarily what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to say a bit about economics and then a little about politics, if there's time, in the last 30 years after, the first 30 years after communism. So to start with the economy, we need to remember the position at the beginning of transition. There were really two major crises, or two major underlying problems. First of all, there was a macroeconomic and trade crisis, repressed inflation, shortages, growth rates were falling, the trade system was breaking down. So that was very immediate, but at the same time, there were deep underlying problems which had to do with the distorted economic structure. Unusually large industrial and agricultural sectors for a country for countries at the stage of development that the East European countries were at. Very small service sector, extremely large public sector, not much legal private economic activity. Prices were distorted, and especially in Russia and large countries, the geographic location of enterprises was quite bizarre from the point of view of costs in a market economy. So, huge problems and four great challenges. First of all, to alleviate the crisis. Second, to restructure the economy. Third, to reintegrate the economies of these countries with the world economy. And finally, there was the hope of catching up with the West. So what happened? Well, the crisis was alleviated. It took longer than expected, but that happened. Most countries quite rapidly integrated into the world economy. It's a dramatic shift of trade patterns from trade within the communist bloc to trade mostly with Europe. Economies were restructured, but more by the logic of the global economy than by leaders' decisions. This wasn't so much the result of reforms as the result of processes that took place because of the way the global economy worked. After the initial crisis, which lasted quite a long time in some places, most economies grew substantially, and there was dramatic modernization in almost all countries, especially after 2000. But there was no catch-up with the West, or at least the East European countries and the post-Soviet countries remained quite far behind the West. That turned out to be an unrealistic dream. Okay, so just to go over the main elements of that. First of all, macroeconomic crisis. So this is a picture of inflation rates in the post-communist countries, and you see they explode in the early 90s. Then gradually, in some places faster, in many places more slowly, they come down, and they're really quite, they converge to a great extent by the early 2000s. And if we look at how the median inflation rate in the post-communist countries changed over time and compare it to the median inflation rate for all the other countries in the world, we see that it comes down, and by the 2000s, the early 2000s, it's pretty close. The two are pretty close together. So there's convergence in that sense. Inflation rates in the post-communist countries don't look that different by then. Unemployment starts at practically zero because officially there was no unemployment in communist economies. Shoots up, a great deal of variation, in some places extremely high. But again, if we compare the unemployment rate in the median country among the post-communist countries to that in the median in all other countries, we see that unemployment rises to a peak by the late 1990s, and then it comes down, and again, pretty much converges with the rate in the rest of the world. So in unemployment also, the post-communist countries start to look very much like other countries around the world. What about economic structure? Well, I said the post-communist countries started out with overdeveloped industry, you could say, a very large industrial sector. Also, agriculture was larger than you would expect for countries at their level of economic development, and extremely undeveloped service sectors. And we see that changed during the 1990s. By the end of the 90s, the size of these different sectors in the average post-communist countries was very much similar to what one sees in other countries at the same income level. So there was convergence in the structure of the economies. Was there catch up with the West? Well, of course, under communism, Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union had been falling further behind the advanced economies of Western Europe. So here is the blue line is the average income level in the leading Western European countries. The orange line is Eastern Europe, the gray line is the former USSR. So clearly the post-communist, the communist world at that time was falling further behind. But what many of us forgot at the time was that in fact Eastern Europe and the former Soviet countries and the Russian Empire had been falling behind Western Europe, not just since the beginning of communism, but since the Industrial Revolution. So if we, using Madison's data, plot these lines going all the way back to 1800, we see that it was nothing particularly new about the communist period. In fact, in the communist period, the gap perhaps grew less than previously it had been growing. So there was this historical pattern of underdevelopment relative to Western Europe. Still, the hope was that the post-communist countries would catch up quickly, which implied a rapid jump in GDP per capita to reach the levels of the West. It didn't happen. So what happened instead was what you see here. Still a huge gap between the average levels of income in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and Western Europe as of today. So the question we have to ask is, was the hope to rapidly catch up with the West realistic? Was it reasonable? And how can we think about that? Well, to catch up in, let's say, 10 years would have required the former Soviet countries to grow about 140% on average in that 10 years, and the East European countries to grow by 200% on average. In the history of the world, only a handful of countries have done that. First of all, petrostates like Equatorial Guinea, they get oil, suddenly they go from almost zero GDP per capita to very high levels. The post-World War II Marshall Plan countries, Germany and France, achieved that with a lot of help. The East Asian tigers, so Japan and Singapore, did that. And then some very poor countries, countries starting out from very low level. Obviously, if you're starting from zero, increasing by 140% is increasing by not very much. So a few countries like that. But in fact, no country has ever grown as fast as would have been required to catch up with the West. No country has ever grown that fast that was starting from an income above $6,300. So for middle-income countries, it simply doesn't happen that you grow that fast. And the average income in Eastern Europe, purchasing power parity in 1989, was about $12,000, about $15,000 in the former Soviet Union, basically because of some countries with oil. If we look at how the former Soviet bloc, post-communist countries did grow, and compare that to growth, the median growth rate in other countries in the world, we see that after the initial sharp contraction, growth was relatively fast among the post-communist countries, and they ended up, over the 30 years, doing better, ultimately, than the median for the rest of the world. Now, some of the post-communist countries grew unusually fast, given their relatively rich starting point. So if we look at how fast the recognized leaders in global growth did, how fast they grew in the 10 years after their GDP per capita first hit $12,000, right? The level of Eastern Europe as of, or the average level in Eastern Europe as of 1989. So in the 10 years after Hong Kong hit a GDP per capita of $12,000, it grew 84%, South Korea 78%, and so on. How about the post-communist countries? Well, some of them grew, well, Estonia grew even faster in the 10 years after it hit $12,000. Russia, well, that's because of oil, but Lithuania, Latvia, Slovakia, in the 10 years after they reached that 12,000 threshold, actually grew extremely fast at rates comparable to those of countries that are recognized as having been growth leaders. So to sum up this part, the post-communist countries had a painful economic transition. They converged macroeconomically and in economic structure with the rest of the world. They integrated into trade with Europe, but they didn't catch up with the West in income because almost no countries ever catch up with the leaders, and especially not countries that start from a relatively high level. Now there's a lot of variation around the average. So by 2017, income per capita ranged from 2,900 in Tajikistan to about 32,600 in the Czech Republic. So I've been talking about medians and averages, huge variation around those. And that variation reflected comparative advantage more than reform strategy. We talked a lot about reform strategy in the early years, but basically what seems to have mattered over the last 30 years is comparative advantage. So the East European countries could integrate into the German auto industry and other industries. The oil-rich countries developed their oil or gas. For the other countries, it was much harder to figure out just what their comparative advantage was in the international economy. So moving on to the political system, one thing we need to remember is that the East, as with income, the East had always lagged the West in democracy. So here is one measure of democracy, electoral democracy here, put together by VDEM, which is a group that compiles indexes of democracy. And we see, yes, in the communist period, Eastern Europe and the former USSR were far below the level of democracy in Western Europe, but in fact, going back to 1800, there'd always been this very significant gap in the level of democracy on average in the Eastern countries. And if we just project what one might have hoped for based on the pre-communist trend, we see that the jump in democracy after the end of communism, although frustratingly incomplete when we compare it to the levels in Western Europe, was maybe not so surprising given the previous patterns. Same thing if we look at an indicator of liberal democracy. Again, a big gap between the West in all periods and what happened in Eastern Europe and former USSR after the end of communism doesn't look that surprising given the whole history of the relative performance in terms of regime type, in terms of democracy, going back to 1800. Okay, in the early 1990s, on average, the post-communist countries caught up to the level of democracy of other countries at their income level. So here, the blue line is the level of democracy, again using VDEM, the level of democracy predicted based on the income of the post-communist countries, the income level. And there's, as we know, a very strong relationship between the level of economic development or income and the level of democracy. So the blue line is what we should expect based on the economic development of these countries. We see they start out in the 80s far below what one should expect based on their income. They converge to what one should expect, and they overshoot in terms of electoral democracy Here it is in terms of liberal democracy, so they quickly converge to the level that their income would predict. In recent years, there's been some backsliding. So, to sum this up, on average, the post-communist countries quickly converged to the level of democracy predicted by their income levels. They overshot a bit with regard to electoral democracy. They've slid back a bit in both electoral and liberal democracy in the last few years. And again, there's huge variation. We see places like Azerbaijan, an autocracy around the level of China and Cuba. On the other hand, Slovenia is a liberal democracy around the level of France or Germany. So, to wrap up, lessons and surprises. Well, economic transition was longer, it was more painful than expected, because we underestimated the extent of crisis and the historical difficulty of convergence. I think we were over-optimistic. And I think, to get back to what Ivan was saying, I think we can understand part of the frustration, despite the objectively, in some ways, quite good economic performance of countries like Poland, in that they expected to converge with the West, and they compare themselves to the West, and they still find themselves, Poland at an income level below Portugal, when they had hopes of being more in the middle of the Western pack. We see a big increase in variation among the post-communist countries. This correlates with geography, because different countries have differential access to the world economy, different resource endowments, different comparative advantage, and that turned out to matter much more than reform strategy. Deliberate choices, reform strategies weren't, I think, that important. All countries went through similar processes. It was geography and initial development levels that mostly predict how they ended up. Political regimes quickly converged to the levels predicted by income. Now, at the start, everybody was concerned that there was going to be a populist backlash against the pain of reform, that people would vote against reformers. Instead, what happened was just a backlash against pain. And you see this if you analyze the data. All the incumbents were blamed for a bad economy, whether they were reformists or whether they were trying to reverse reforms. And in fact, reforms generally continued, despite the very active turnover of governments in the 1990s. And the simplest way to summarize what has happened to these countries in the 30 years since, I think, is to focus on geography. Countries have become more like their neighbors. Eastern Europe developed, and now these countries also are experiencing not unique post-communist problems, but problems which are actually experienced by their close neighbors. So Eastern Europe developed, but didn't catch up to Western Europe. Still, it's closest to Western Europe, and now it's experiencing the same populist wave that we see in Western Europe. Central Asia, squeezed between Islamism and authoritarianism, so closest neighbors of Central Asia, Afghanistan, China, so we see sort of different possibilities there. Politics in the Caucasus is not that unlike politics in Turkey and Iran, or at least it's in that general ballpark. And Russia is somewhere between China and Eastern Europe, which gives you the sense of how things can swing, or these sort of unpleasant mixtures that we perhaps observe in Russia at various points. Thank you very much.